Israel-Hamas negotiations over the weekend have intensified in Cairo as thousands took to the streets of Tel Aviv, calling on the Israeli government to reach a ceasefire and secure the release of hostages. This latest protest took place on the eve of Holocaust Remembrance Day in Israel and 7 months into this war now. Prime Minister Netanyahu said Israel is willing to pause fighting in Gaza in exchange for hostages, but that it will not agree to end the war and withdraw forces from Gaza. And just this morning, Hamas claimed responsibility for a mortar attack on the Kerem Shalom border crossing. Israeli officials say now that several people were injured and it has closed that crossing to aid trucks going into Gaza. For more on where all of this leaves negotiations at this hour, I spoke earlier to the former State Department negotiator Aaron David Miller. Thank you for being here again this morning.
Thanks for having me.
Prime Minister Netanyahu earlier today rejected Hamas's demands for a complete end to the war in Gaza in exchange for the release of hostages. He does seem to be open to a pause in fighting. Is that the main sticking point, do you think, at this point? How do you interpret his position?
I mean, it's not just his position. The reality is that you've got two parties, Israel and Hamas, the major combatants in this campaign, both of whom are pledged to destroy one another. On one side, a decision maker, Mr. Netanyahu, who is putting more stock, frankly, in preserving his right-wing coalition than in striking a deal. In the other, the primary Palestinian decision maker, Yahya Sinwar, ensconced in a tunnel somewhere under Rafah Khan Yunis, abusing Israeli hostages, particularly the women, strikes me to be in no urgency either to reach a deal. He figures that tunnels, time, and the hostages will ultimately create enough pressure so that he can survive and emerge as an effective governing force in Gaza still. So the only party that appears to be in a hurry, understandably, is the Biden administration, both for foreign policy and domestic political reasons.
Well, let me ask you about the visit that Secretary Blinken had on Friday. The Washington Post reported that at that time, Blinken told Qatar that it should expel Hamas if they continue to reject a ceasefire deal. How likely is that? How much pressure is the United States under at this point?
You know, I think that's one of the reasons that Yahya Sinwar, the key military leader of Hamas, may be considering a pause, at least phase one of a pause. You know, the Qataris clearly have bankrolled Hamas, actually over the last decade with Israeli acquiescence. But nonetheless, they have proven themselves at times to be effective mediators. I don't see the administration following through right now. That may well be the result if, in fact, you get a negotiated agreement in the weeks and months to come. But I don't see the administration forcing the Qataris to expel Hamas, and I'm not sure they would. We have a critically important air base in Qatar, Al Udeid, and so we have interest there as well.
There is obviously increased pressure worldwide, I guess, because of the reality that the World Food Programme's executive director says there is now a famine in northern Gaza and it is going to spread south. How much is and I want to talk about the protests and things happening in the U.S., but how much is the pressure on keeping people alive in Gaza, how much is that affecting the deal and the negotiations?
I mean, it plays a role, but if in fact international pressure was as severe as it is, you would have thought by now on both parties that they would have softened their positions. But the fact is, since October 7, it is the two principal combatants, Israel and Hamas, that have shaped the tactics, the strategy, the periods of escalation, de-escalation of this conflict. And what it demonstrates to me time and again, based on my decades of involvement in these issues, is that the Middle East is literally littered with the remains of great powers who believe they can impose their will on smaller ones. When you get into an existential conflict with each side fundamentally believing that its vital national interests, in the case of Hamas's senior leadership, its existence is at stake, outside pressures are not terribly effective in changing the fundamental calculations of the two main players.
We've seen in the past weeks, Hamas released 2 videos of hostages, including 2 hostages with American citizenship. We've seen, obviously, not just the protests elsewhere, but protests inside Israel. Do you think either of those factors, because you're talking about how they're not really bending to international pressure, are they bending to anything that's happening inside?
I mean, I think the one factor it seems to have gotten the Netanyahu government's attention, and that of the prime minister, is reports, some credible, some not, that the International Criminal Court and its key prosecutor, Karim Khan, are considering arrest warrants for the prime minister, the minister of defense, and the chief of staff over alleged war crimes. Whether that's true or not, and I know the Israelis are very, very concerned about it, that strikes me as something that has gotten the prime minister's attention. I'm not sure they'll go through with this. But I think that more than anything else, and I don't think, frankly, that is going to fundamentally erode either Hamas's calculation or the prime minister's.
Let me ask you about the protests happening in your country on college campuses, these encampments that we've seen through the U.S., some of it happening here in Canada as well. We've seen a lot of disruption, some violence, and finally President Biden having to speak out about what is happening and try to send a message about free speech, the right to protest, lawlessness, and anti-Semitism. How do you think he has managed this?
His statement clearly reflects the fact that the administration is concerned. In the cohort of 18 to 29-year-olds, it's clear that even though Mr. Biden has an advantage over presumptive Republican nominee, that space is narrowing. But look, in the end, I think, to give you my bottom line on these demonstrations, not to doubt the conviction of most of the demonstrators, this is going to hurt President Biden. This is going to help Donald Trump. This will have zero impact on U.S. Middle East policy, and it's not going to do anything to relieve the misery and the suffering of Gaza's 2.3 million Palestinians.
What should we watch for in the next 24, 48 hours, do you think? Because it's, as I said to you before we started, it's very hard to get a handle on how close we may or may not be.
Well, the presence of William Burns, U.S. CIA director, is a very important signal. It means that these talks are serious. He's developed a very close relationship with the head of Israel's Mossad, but the Israelis haven't even sent a delegation to Cairo. So watch that space, because if it doesn't happen, I'm not sure that the administration has any plan B to de-escalate Israeli military activity, surge humanitarian assistance into Gaza, and even think realistically about ways to actually end the Israel-Hamas war.
Aaron David Miller, good to see you again, sir. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.